Welcome, everyone, to episode 6 of the TIMI Talks podcast. I'm David Berg, here with my co-host, Nick Marston. On today's show, we will be joined by renowned clinical trialist and leader in cardiovascular medicine, Dr. Bob Harrington, to discuss his insights and reflections on the world of cardiovascular clinical trials. All right, Nick. Well, this is an exciting episode for us.
Yeah, it really is, David. When we decided to launch this podcast, we really wanted it to be a forum to highlight the people and the promise of clinical trials. And that list of people obviously includes many who are outside of our immediate orbit. And so with this week's discussant, we can proudly say that we're moving beyond the walls of TIMI and actually heading to the West Coast to kick off a string of guests from around the country. So a bit of a road trip, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's one thing to be able to walk across the hall and ask a friend to join us on the podcast, but sending a cold email to someone you've never met before really is a whole different thing. Fortunately, Bob Harrington was incredibly warm and gracious in accepting our invitation.
He certainly was. And I think the opportunity to, talk trials certainly got his attention. But he's also an experienced podcaster with his own Bob Harrington show. And so hopefully he'll teach us a few things in that regard as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm taking notes on sort of everything he says. Well, for the benefit of our listeners, why don't I go ahead and introduce our guest? As you heard, Dr. Bob Harrington is going to be coming on the show. And Dr. Harrington is the Arthur L. Bloomfield Professor of Medicine and Chair of the Department of Medicine at Stanford University. But he started his career at Duke University Medical Center, where he trained in cardiology, interventional cardiology, and clinical research. And during the 20 years that he spent on the faculty at Duke, he led many clinical trials, specifically studying antithrombotic therapies to treat acute ischemic heart disease, and ultimately became the director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute, or the DCRI. In addition to being a renowned clinician and scientist, he's a beloved leader, serving as the president of the American Heart Association from 2019 to 2020. So let's go ahead and bring Bob on the show.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Dr. Harrington. We really appreciate you joining us.
I appreciate you having me. I look forward to the conversation.
So we have a lot of topics that we'd like to cover today, including your career in clinical trials, how clinical trials are evolving, and your leadership in the field. But first, as two dads raising their families in Boston, we want to hear about your Massachusetts roots and if you're still a Boston sports fan.
That's a great way to start out. And, it probably wouldn't take your listeners long to hear my voice. And although I haven't lived in Boston for over 30 years, I still sound like I grew up in Somerville. I grew up in the Boston area in Somerville. I went to college in Massachusetts, graduated from med school at Tufts, did my residency and chief residency at UMass out in Worcester.
Very nice.
So I love Massachusetts. I love Boston. And yes, I am a passionate Boston sports fan. I start every day reading the Boston Globe sports page. And the best invention for me is having newspapers on my iPad. So I have no idea what's going on in the city of San Francisco on any given day, but I can tell you everything that's going on in Boston.
Good. So Steph Curry and the Warriors haven't got to you yet then.
What I tell my friends here is the best I can do is I don't hate the Warriors. Because I'm a classic Boston sports fan of my generation that, grew up listening to Johnny Most for the Celtics games, talking about Philadelphia as the city of brotherly hate. And I pull for all of them. But most of all, there's almost an obsession with the Boston Red Sox. So love talking about Boston sports. Love particularly talking about the Red Sox.
Love to hear that. Yeah, well, we're going to need all the good juju we can get from you to get the C's to the next round of the NBA playoffs.
I think somehow they have to scrub the Boston Garden. I think that's part of the challenge here. After the Bruins loss and then the Celtics, that first game against Philly. Fortunately, they rebounded the next game, and we'll see what happens next. But I agree with you. They know what they need to do. They just need to do it.
Totally. I mean, it's an amazingly talented team, and so I'm still optimistic. But
I'm a Boston sports fan. I remain internally pessimistic,
I
but
guess our roots are shining through, I guess.
I read Dan Shaughnessy a couple times a week, so
it's amazing. It's amazing. Well, I do recognize the accent, and I appreciate it. My wife. So I'm actually from Arizona, but my wife is from a town outside of Boston called Winthrop, Massachusetts.
yeah.
And so she had a pretty thick Boston accent growing up, which has sort of faded over time. But when she was an intern in the CCU, she's an oncologist now, but she's an intern in the CCU. She was post-call and incredibly tired. She was giving her presentation, and she said, the patient presented with a STEMI, and they had a drug-eluting stent was placed to the obtuse marginal artery. It snuck out. It was a great moment that she hasn't lived down. But,
I appreciate my friends outside of Boston always make fun of me when I introduce my wife as Rhonda.
It's awesome. So on the theme of origin stories, one of the reasons that we're so excited to have you on the podcast today is because obviously you've had a huge impact in cardiovascular clinical trials. And so I thought you might tell us a little bit about how you became interested in and I guess involved in clinical trials.
Yeah, so when I was a resident at UMass in Worcester, as we had said a few minutes ago, I became really interested in thrombosis, working in the lab of a hematologist at UMass at the time by the name of Jack Ansell, one of the great clinician investigators in thrombosis over the years. And Jack had me really excited about all things thrombosis. And so when I went to Duke to do my fellowship, I actually intended to do basic science. I was going to study the adhesive proteins of coagulation, fibronectin, vitronectin, and in fact, in Duke in those days, you matched into a laboratory, and so I was going to work in the laboratory of a guy by the name of Dr. David Sane, who was a cardiologist really working in the area of thrombosis. And for a variety of reasons, I met Rob Califf, who I think your listeners will know as a longtime clinical trialist, clinical researcher at Duke, and now the FDA commissioner. And Rob was the CCU attending, and it was one of those nights, and you guys will never remember these days, but we used to have to go actually to the cath lab, load up cath films, and look at them. And so the attendings could never do that themselves, so they would always grab a fellow to come with them. So that hasn't changed today. But I went with Rob to the cath lab, and on the way there, he said, "Hey, what are you going to do with your life?" So I told him, and he said, "God, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard." Knowing Rob now for many years, I reflect back, and what he was trying to say is, how are you going to be an interventional cardiologist and a basic scientist at the same time? Because remember, this was the days of angioplasty without stents. This was heparin and aspirin in a balloon is what we had in the cath lab. And so he began to talk with me over the months ahead about that they were going to be really embarking on a whole series of clinical trials with antithrombotic therapies. And it was going to be a great time. And might I be interested in coming to a research group that then was known as the Duke Data Bank for Cardiovascular Disease. And they were starting this study called Gusto, which you'll all remember as one of the first really big fibrinolytic trials based out of the United States. And so fast forward, when I got to my research time a couple years later at Duke, I went and spent a couple years in the data bank, really looking at first, thrombosis-oriented clinical trials. And Rob was right. It was a great time. It was the 2B3 inhibitors. It was the thrombin inhibitors, subsequently the ADP inhibitors. If you were interested in thrombosis, the 90s and that period from 2000 to 2010 was a great time to understand clinical trials, factor 10 inhibitors. I mean, it was just an amazing time. And so that's how I got involved in clinical trials, because my original career choice, Califf thought, was a dumb one.
Well, that's really interesting to hear. And obviously since then, you've had a huge impact on the field of cardiovascular medicine at Duke. And when you reflect on your time there at DCRI, one of the things David and I were curious to hear about were any kind of key lessons or things that you learned about clinical trial leadership.
Yeah. So when I began, as I said, at the data bank, and the data bank then morphed into what's now known as the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Um, there were a lot of lessons about clinical trials, and I became, as I started my career, really interested in some ways in the mechanistic clinical trials. I was interested, for example, if you look at the early part of my CV, in doing a lot of the platelet aggregation and flow cytometry studies with the 2B3 inhibitors, for example, or the ADP inhibitors, and really interested in, I would say, more early phase investigation. But as I really got into the world of clinical trials, I became excited by this notion of putting really large organizations together in ways that people could collaborate and answer important clinical questions. And I became as much interested in the methodologies of doing research, and in particular clinical trials, as I did in the specific question. And DCRI was a great place for that because there was everything going on, from small first in human experiments up through the so-called global mega trials. And for me, some of the key lessons about clinical trials are things that fit my personality as well. First off, clinical trials, without question, it's all about the people. If you look at a place like DCRI, if you look at something like the TIMI study group, it's really the people coming together that makes these things happen. And that's the real, both the fun and the magic. And you need people of really different types of talent. You need clinicians, you need statisticians, you need informaticians, project managers, you need study coordinators. You need people with expertise in safety, people with expertise in logistics. And so it's this remarkable opportunity to really put teams together to try and answer questions. And for clinical trial leadership, you have to be somebody who's interested, first off, in collaborating, because there's no way you do a clinical trial by yourself, um, with maybe a few exceptions. And so you have to be somebody that enjoys collaborating, putting teams together, pulling groups together, and recognizing that you're asking people, patients, subjects, to participate in an experiment. And I always describe it that way to trainees, that these are human experiments, so that they have both a sense of respect and awe at the whole process, that people are agreeing to allow you to study them in a way that might inform not just their care, but other people's. So, as a leader, you really need to be somebody who thinks about collaboration. You need to be somebody who thinks with sensitivity about the broader issues of involving patients and subjects in these experiments. You've got to be somebody who thinks both clinically and quantitatively, and you've got to be somebody who can really understand operational issues and how this all gets pulled together. So a lot of things go into leading clinical trials, and you know this from the vantage point of the TIMI study group, which does a superb job at this. Um, they're very unique entities, clinical trials. You also have to understand that you're not going to get an answer tomorrow. Sometimes for young clinical trialists, that's hard, because the first time, for me at any one time, I have a number of things that I'm involved with, all of which might become information might become available at any time along the way. But when you're starting out, it might be 2 or 3 years before you really actually have a product to show for your work. So patience is probably another good virtue of a clinical trials leader.
I love that. I mean, I think you hit on a lot of things that certainly resonate for Nick and myself. Yeah, the collaborative nature of this being so fun. I just remember the first time I kind of realized how many different people are involved in clinical trials. It was pretty eye-opening. Certainly the themes of patience, I think, definitely resonate with both of us.
Yep.
And I think that sort of that role as being a clinician, where you're fundamentally thinking about patients in a very direct way, and then sort of pairing that with an investigation, where you're trying to answer these broader scientific questions, that kind of trying to wear both of those hats at the same time, and sort of having a respect for what you're asking patients to do by participating in these studies. I think that's really an important theme. So thank you for sharing that. I guess you touched on kind of the breadth of trials that you have been involved in, from smaller mechanistic stuff all the way up to kind of the large phase 3 mega trials. And looking back on all of those different trials, many of which you alluded to were focused on novel antithrombotic therapies, and in particular antiplatelet therapies. Is there one trial that sort of stands out to you as having had the greatest impact on clinical practice, or maybe one that you're particularly proud of?
Oh, well, I always like to say that I'm not a point estimate guy. I'm a confidence interval guy. So maybe I'll give you a couple of them because your question has some interesting twists in it. The first clinical trial I ever worked on was something that when I first got to the data bank, I was assigned to be the safety officer for something called CARS, the Coumadin aspirin reinfarction study. This was trying to understand if a fixed dose of warfarin plus aspirin might be beneficial post MI. And I bring it up because it was a great example of being given a fairly focused task. So I was the one assigned to look at the blinded INR data every day and to work with the sites, sending out adjustments of doses, sending out safety notices, et cetera. So I had this very, very specific role. But here were some of the people involved with that trial. Valentin Fuster was the PI. Dr. Brunwald was the chair of the DSMB. And because of that, at this young stage of life in clinical trials, I got a chance regularly to interact with Drs. Fuster and Brunwald. And one of the things that's always stuck with me is how kind and generous both of them were with their time and attention with things that I was trying to do within the context of this very large trial. And I've never forgotten that. And it was really a great opportunity to be introduced to leaders of the field back in the early 1990s. Just a really remarkable experience. The one that I might be most proud of is the Pursuit trial, which was also done in the 90s. It was with eptifibatide, one of the glycoprotein 2B3A receptor blockers, in the non-ST elevation MI, or at that time, MI and unstable angina, so ACS population. And I was proud of it for a couple of reasons. After having mostly worked on small projects within what was then morphing from the data bank to the DCRI, this was really the first project that I got to be the coordinating center PI. So there were others more senior, including Dr. Kalev, Dr. Topol, Dr. Simoons from the Netherlands as the overall study leaders, but I was the coordinating center PI. And it was really during that activity that I really got to see firsthand how these big organizations came together. So CARS was my introduction to multi-center clinical trials as a fellow, and then as a junior faculty member, getting to lead the coordinating center for Pursuit was really a big deal. It was a very large trial, largest of its kind at the time, and ended up with study results that helped get the drug approved and used for many years in clinical practice.
Well, certainly hearing you speak about your experiences early on with Dr. Braunwald and Dr. Fuster, that's incredibly impactful for sure. And we've been able to have some of that experience with Dr. Braunwald, still very involved with trials and at the TIMI study group. And there's really nothing quite like it. When we think about, you've talked a lot about the trials of the past, and really one of the more recent themes has been the use of pragmatic or adaptive trial designs, and which I know you've been involved with. And this, of course, has the potential to offset the high cost of traditional clinical trials, possibly even aid in recruitment or have other advantages. So, looking ahead, how do you kind of see clinical trials in cardiovascular medicine evolving? And as investigators, how can we best prepare ourselves for some of these potential changes?
Yeah, this is an area where I spend a lot of my time, a lot of my thought time, a lot of working in various working groups for organizations to try to make change in the clinical trials process. I think we're really at a crisis point in the clinical trials world. There's so many questions. I mean, biology and our biologic understanding has given us an opportunity to really ask so many questions about new therapies, new strategies, new devices that might be beneficial to patients. But yet we have this real bottleneck in terms of how we study them. First off, there's been this, what I'll call artificial separation from clinical practice and clinical research. And one of the remaining goals of my career is to see how we can bring those two closer together. We have the technology, as they say. We ought to be able to better incorporate research into clinical practice. And in the ideal world, that would be almost seamless. I've been quoted as saying many times that clinicians fundamentally make two types of decisions, one of which is the answer is known. And the example I usually give is aspirin for ST elevation MI patients. Virtually everybody with an ST elevation MI ought to get aspirin. And the system in which we operate ought to help enforce that, make sure that everybody gets aspirin. The second type of decisions we make are when the answer is not quite so clear. And this is the vast majority of what we do. These are the so-called class 2 recommendations in our guidelines, where the evidence does not push us one way or another to either do it or not do it. And I think that the system should help us study it. And we now have that ability with electronic health records and a variety of other tools and technologies to be able to study more and more things immediately at the point of care. And I've always been intrigued, particularly since moving west, is how the tech companies do this so-called A/B testing of virtually everything they're doing. Those are just randomized trials. Well, why aren't we doing that with virtually everything we're doing? So I would like to better incorporate research into practice. And I think that there's a variety of ways to do that. And then you're referring to some of what I'll call the methodologic refinements or improvements in trials, the adaptive trial designs, the pragmatic trial designs, using a platform of clinical trials to continuously answer questions, in a disease state, say like COVID, where you can move from one agent of interest to another and be able to discard therapies along the way because you've used, for example, Bayesian statistics to understand what's the probability that this is not going to work, and be able to discard things along the way. So yeah, I think that this is an exciting time. The technology is certainly not our limitation. It's the social cultural issues that has left us with this really artificial divide between practice and research that we need to bring back together. And that's what I'm most excited and enthusiastic about.
Well, there's so much, I think, packed into that, and so maybe I'll probe you a little bit to try to unpack some of it. I think you alluded to this move you made out west, which for our listeners, in 2012, Dr. Harrington moved to become the chair of medicine at Stanford. And I was actually an undergrad at Stanford, and I always joke, it's a little known connection. You probably didn't know that. I knew about you being the chair, but not the other way. But yeah, so I joke with my college friends that the only thing you're not supposed to do if you graduate from Stanford in 2006 is move to the East Coast and go to medical school, because like everybody else had these incredible opportunities in tech and that were just taken off at the time. But of course, like you said, there tech's everywhere, and we certainly see a lot of emerging applications of that in medicine and also clinical trials. And so you're kind of uniquely positioned with your background in clinical trials and also being immersed in the world of tech in the Bay Area to sort of bring these worlds together. And I think you alluded to nicely some of the kind of artificial gaps that separate these. And so I wonder if you might give us some concrete examples of how tech can be leveraged to improve the way we design and execute cardiovascular clinical trials, because I do think you're right that there's a lot of opportunity there.
Oh, it's such a great question, and I am amazed that you left the Bay Area after I can't think of a better life than being a Stanford undergrad. It strikes me as almost magical when I go around campus, and I have a saying that when I'm trying to recruit somebody to Stanford, if I realize that they were an undergrad or they grew up in the area, I refer to it as the salmon effect, in that all salmon are trying to get back to the farm. So that so at some point, maybe we should have a talk about recruiting you out here, because all Stanford people want to return. Um, but having said that, I do think that you're spot on, that the tech is going to help enable so many things, everything from trial awareness to recruitment to collection of data, to reporting of results, and every step along the way. And we've written about this with other people as well, how we might use tech to do a better job. And let me give you a couple of examples. We were involved, Stanford, in my department, with a big project called the Apple Heart Study, which was trying to understand if you could use the Apple Watch. So think of it as just using a wearable to try to understand background incidents of atrial fibrillation in a previously non-AFib population. It was not a randomized trial, but so many great lessons. So first off, you got consented over your iPhone. That's remarkable. And people were able to do that and give us consent to collect their private health data. Secondly, we were able to monitor them continuously using the sensor device. Third, we were able to make a tentative diagnosis of atrial fibrillation and then contact them so that they could have a physician visit via telehealth to understand what they might have been experiencing during that, what the sensor was detecting. And then we would send them a patch that they would wear for a week to see if we could pick up on the patch the atrial fibrillation. We recruited over 500,000 or almost 500,000 people in less than a year. Think about that. I've never been involved in a project that has representative patients from, in this case, subjects from every single state. So the possibilities are mind-boggling. Recruit people, engage them, collect their data, and then use that tool to disseminate the information, to send out tweets, to post things on social media, to talk about the trial results. Yeah, the trial got reported in the traditional journal and big medical meeting, but then it can get widely pumped out using technology tools. So that's just one example of many of the ways that we can use these tools to better facilitate the research process.
That's a great example. And I think about the Apple Heart Study a lot, and how many patients were enrolled, especially when we're maybe working on a trial that is slow to enroll and we're kind of in the trenches for it. If that can kind of be translated to randomized clinical trials, there really is such power there. And hopefully COVID seems to kind of have expedited the evolution of clinical trials to be more virtual visits, home visits, in some cases virtual consent, as you point out. So I do think that's going to be a big a big change down the line for clinical trials that would be welcome and allow us to do larger trials at a cheaper cost. I want to pivot a little bit here away from clinical trials and talk a bit more about leadership, which we alluded to a little bit already. You've, of course, led many clinical trials and studies. You're the chair of medicine at Stanford. You're also the president of AHA, which we haven't mentioned yet. And so we'd love to hear your reflections on leadership more generally, and specifically kind of what you think really makes a strong leader.
Good question. I'm still evolving in my own leadership journey here, but I think that fundamentally good leaders have a couple of characteristics, and then good leaders make known what their values in leadership are, because people can lead with very different styles and can successfully lead with very different styles. But I think that fundamentally leaders have one of two characteristics, and people don't have to have one or the other of these. Most good leaders have some combination of them, but they need to have some vision for where their group is going. And they need to be able to articulate that vision so that people can get excited and understand where the group or the project or the team might be leading. The second is that good leaders care about the people that are on their team, and people know that. And leaders can make some mistakes that can be forgiven if they're the kind of people who have gained the respect of the people that they're trying to lead, because we're all going to make mistakes and mishaps along the way, and it's your team that can pull you back up. So respect for the people, care for the people, and a vision. And then I think under that, there's individual values that people have. And I'll just give you some of the things that I talk about in our department all the time. I want to be first and foremost inclusive. There's a lot of different talents on the team, and bringing them together is what really makes for a successful leadership when you're really maximizing the talent of all the individual contributors on your team. And you're going to have to recognize that that means diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences, diverse expertise. Really think about diversity in the broadest sense of the word. You want to bring that together on your team because you will do better with a diverse leadership team. You want to be transparent. You want to talk about what you're trying to accomplish, but you also want to be honest with people about what you can and can't do. So I talk about transparency all the time in our own department. Sometimes people say to me, Bob, I don't need that much detail. I know you want to be transparent, but I don't need that much detail. Well, I'm going to always err on the side of transparency. You want to have honesty and truthfulness. People need to know that you're of high integrity. You'll make mistakes. You'll admit them. You'll be honest about it. You'll tell people the truth because that's important as we try to move teams forward. So those are some of the things that I think about from my own leadership, and I try to incorporate that set of values into the things I do as a leader.
I mean, that's a phenomenal list of qualities in a leader, and you've really done a remarkable job bringing those traits to bear in your various leadership roles. But I can imagine that even with a clear vision, as you described, that some things may be easier said than done. And so I wonder if you might share some examples of some of your biggest challenges as a leader and maybe how you dealt with them.
Yeah, I mean, leadership is, as I said, it's a journey, and you have to pay attention to it. One of the things I learned in my tenure as the director of the DCRI is that I felt that I didn't have the skill set to lead non-clinical people. So the professionals, the COO, the CFO, the chief of human resources, that really are the talented professionals that make a research group like the DCRI go. Um, I was good at leading cardiologists and good at leading physicians and good at leading scientists, but what did I know about, leading these highly experienced executives? And I learned an important lesson. It was actually in talking with the chief of human resources at DCRI at the time, who he said, Bob, these are skills that can be taught and can be learned. And so I really reflected on that and ended up, after much reflection and thinking about, well, do I need to go back to school? Do I need to get an MBA? Do I need to take some classes? And he suggested, and I did it. I got the services of an executive coach who really has helped me. That was over 15 years ago. I got the services of an executive coach, and I dedicated myself to a really deep dive into leadership. And she helped me tremendously with my leadership learning. And I still utilize the same executive coach today, 15 plus years later. Now, I don't meet with her as regularly as I did when I was first starting, but leadership skills and techniques can be learned. And maybe that's the most important lesson that I've learned along the way, is that just like we learn any other, you learn how to cath, you learn how to read an echo. You can learn leadership, but you have to devote yourself to it.
I love that. I think that's a really great lesson. And it's interesting you're talking about having a coach. You've been kind of ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. I think one other avenue that you've navigated incredibly well in your career has been effective use of media. So, for example, I think both Nick and I have listened to your Medscape interviews and Medscape podcast. And just like having a coach, way before your times, I think you've been involved in this world long before kind of podcasts became, quite ubiquitous. So I wonder what advice you might give to early career clinicians and investigators about effective use of media, especially to those like Nick and myself who are really kind of new to the world of podcasts and medical communication.
So I think fundamentally, the reason I got involved in a lot of these things, like using social media, I'm active on Twitter. As you said, I have the podcast on Medscape, is because another central tenet of my leadership is that I believe that you should be constantly communicating. And a tenet of my communication style is that I believe that you should use different modalities to communicate, because we all learn as adults in different ways. Some of us learn through listening. So some of us will benefit from listening to a podcast. Some of us learn by reading. Some of us learn by going to a talk. Some of us learn in 5-minute increments. Some of us learn in longer increments. And so I try in all of my leadership activities to constantly being communicating. And so what have I learned, for example, with podcasting and with my experience on Twitter? First off, I think it helps to be curious. Like I love just learning new things. And so I'm constantly curious and asking, well, why did that happen? And if you listen to my podcast, my style is to interview, and I call it the man on the street approach, is that I just want to have a conversation and ask the kind of questions that interest me. And so, if I'm interviewing an author, I read their book, and I want to ask how they got to the point that they got to in their stories, etc. I love to ask questions, and I love to engage in debate and discussions. But one of the things I've definitely learned, and I've talked about this on my own podcast, is that I also really believe in respectful conversation and civil conversation. And I get dismayed at times at some of the nasty tones that conversations can take, and I don't like that. And so I try to role model in a very opposite direction. I always try to be civil. I always try to be respectful. It doesn't mean I can't vehemently disagree with you. In fact, I tell our faculty, disagree with me. Be forceful about your disagreement. Be data driven about your disagreement, but be civil and be respectful. We're colleagues. And I think that's the essence of university life that sometimes gets threatened. Know your persona. I tell this to our faculty who are thinking about being out on Twitter. I said, people are going to follow you if they know why they're following you. There's several people I follow. Harlan Krumholz, Eric Topol come to mind, precisely because they have good taste in science. And I love the things that they throw out there and say for reading, because they have good taste in the literature and science, and they make me read things that I might not have otherwise read. So those are some of the lessons I've learned as I think about doing podcasts and trying to be active on Twitter.
Well, you've certainly been a role model for so many of us for many, many years, and as expected, this has been a really fun and informative discussion. You've given us a ton of pearls along the way. I just know I'm going to go back to this and listen to it multiple times in the future, just because there's a lot here to unpack, and you've shared so much about clinical trials, and leadership, communication. It's really been awesome. So we want to thank you so much, Bob, for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Oh, the honor's been mine. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Well, Nick, that was another superlative guest on the TIMI Talks podcast.
He really was. He's such a pleasure to talk to, and it was really fun to pick his brain on a variety of topics.
Yeah, totally. I'm curious, what's something that you'll take away from this conversation?
Well, he's obviously just a natural leader and communicator, which has not surprisingly earned him many leadership roles throughout his career. But I think what caught my attention was that even once he had kind of achieved these positions or was at the helm of a large organization, he didn't just rely on this existing skill set that he had. He kind of actively pursued new ways to kind of grow and develop and become even more effective in the role. And so I guess whenever I hear these kind of stories, it always inspires me to, keep trying to improve and grow my career in new ways, which, as he highlights, is really an ongoing process, no matter what career stage you're at. What about you? Was there anything that stood out the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was struck by many of the same things that you were. I mean, he really is such a dynamic speaker and as you said, a natural leader. But I guess another thing that I thought was notable was his authenticity. Whether it was him talking about his early scientific interests or the future of clinical trials or what it means to be a leader, there really was this authentic curiosity and interest in doing it, whatever he was doing it right. And I think that's sort of the je ne sais quoi of leadership in academic cardiovascular medicine. I have to say it was really inspiring, really a treat to hear it firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that does it for another episode of TIMI Talks. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in, and please keep an eye out for future episodes. Until then, this is Nick and David signing off.
Thanks for listening. The TIMI Talks podcast is hosted by Dr. David Berg and Dr. Nick Marston and produced by Kate Brennan. Like and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, and follow us on Twitter @TIMI Study Group to be informed about upcoming episodes.